Shutter speed is simply the amount of time your shutter in your camera is open and is exposed to light, hence why it's also known as exposure time. Logically, the longer the shutter is open, the longer the shutter speed, the more light you collect, the brighter the photo becomes, and the shorter your shutter speed is, the less light your camera collects, and the darker your photo becomes. Shutter speed is measured in seconds. It is often displayed in fractions of seconds because we tend to use shutter speeds faster than a second, such as 1/10 of a second, 1/60th of a second, and 1/500th of a second, all the way up to 1/4000th of a second, which is usually the fastest shutter speed most cameras can provide. We can also go the opposite way, so half a second is longer, also known as slower, than 1/10th, resulting in a brighter photo due to the longer exposure time, and we can extend the exposure time up through 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, all the way up to usually 30 seconds. And most cameras also have a bulb mode where you can extend manually the shutter speed beyond 30 seconds. You can compensate for the amount of brightness that a given shutter speed gives by changing either the aperture or the ISO, or use different neutral density filters. I will not cover more about aperture and ISO in this video, but I do have videos available for that on my channel. My name is Mads Peter Iversen. I make weekly videos about landscape photography where I go out into the field and teach you how to actually take these epic photos. And sometimes I'm also staying back home here in my living room, in my studio, and discuss various topics about landscape photography. If you want to learn more about landscape photography, be sure to subscribe. And when it comes to the technical parts about shutter speed, this is basically everything you need to know about how it relates to exposure, brightness, and light. And speaking of light, if you want to learn how to use light and color in your landscape photography, be sure to get my ebook on that topic. Here I cover everything you will need to know about light, such as the types of light, what light you can experience throughout the day and night, the meaning of color, how all this relates to post-processing, and generally how to use it. Along with my 2 ebooks on composition, which you can get it bundled up with for a small discount, I have also added extended EXIF data to all photo examples in all the ebooks. So it's super easy to see how I captured it, covering not just shutter speed, aperture and ISO, but also whether I bracketed, blended, stacked, or used filters to get the photo. There is a link down in the description to the ebooks. So now let's dig into the fun part about shutter speed, the creative part. As I mentioned a few times on my channel, back when I started out, I usually just smacked a 10-stop filter on the front of my lens and 2-minute long exposed every scene I could get my hands on. Today I'm a little bit more deliberate about my shutter speed. And let's start out by talking about motion blur and how you can use that as an effect to help tell your stories. Motion blur appears either when whatever you are photographing moves in the scene and you are not using a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the moment, or that you move the camera while taking the photo and the entire photo comes out blurry. The longer the shutter speed, the more motion blur you can create. If you want to train this, you can simply just grab your camera, put in a shutter speed of like, let's say 1/3 of a second, and when you hit the shutter, simply just twist the camera. In that way, you should get like this twirly effect. For landscape photographers, with a few exceptions, it is essential to avoid motion blur due to camera movement, as we generally want tack-sharp photos. That is why we usually use a tripod. By using a tripod, we can keep the camera still for any amount of time, which generally should result in a sharp and non-blurred photo. If you're still getting blurry photos despite using a tripod, be sure to check out my video on that subject. If you're hand-holding your camera and want to avoid motion blur due to camera movement, the general recommendation is to use a shutter speed equal to or faster than the value of your focal length. This means if you are photographing at 50mm, you should use a shutter speed of at least 1/50th of a second, and if you are shooting at 400mm, you should use a shutter speed of at least 1/400th of a second. However, with modern image stabilization, you can come away with sharp handheld photos at much slower shutter speeds. It does depend on several different factors such as lens, camera model, and focal length, but I'm sure with a bit of experimentation, you will find where the threshold for sharp handheld photos is for you and your camera setup. Besides tracking birds, you can also go out to the roadside and try with, let's say, 1/50th of a second of a shutter speed and track cars. Just make sure you don't look like a pervert doing so. However, the fun part as a landscape photographer to work with motion blur is that you can blur specific parts of the photo while the rest stays tag sharp, or you can use fast shutter speeds to completely freeze the moment. One of the most important things about photography is to understand the fundamentals so that you can juggle the different techniques. And that's the same thing with motion blur. As you know by now, the faster a subject moves, the faster the shutter speed you will need to freeze the action. As your subject moves over your screen, it takes it a given amount of time to cross that distance. However, if you zoom in and, as an example, half the distance that your screen covers, it will naturally take half the time for the subject to cross your screen, giving the subject moves at the same speed. This means you will need double the shutter speed to freeze that subject. Likewise, if you keep the same focal length, you do not zoom in, but physically move closer to your subject and half the distance between the camera and your subject, it will also result in the subject taking half the time to cross your screen, and you will again need to double the shutter speed to freeze the action. So if you're photographing a waterfall and aim for a certain amount of blur, but for compositional reasons half the distance between the camera and the waterfall, you will need twice as fast a shutter speed to gain the same length of blur on the streaks of the water. And that's because we are counting the individual droplets time it takes to cross over the screen. So both distance to whatever you're photographing and your focal length matters when choosing your shutter speed. There's also a camera setting called shutter speed priority. On Sony cameras symbolized with an S, and on Canon cameras with TV. As a landscape photographer, I rarely use this setting, as my first priority is to get my depth of field right, which is aperture dependent, so I usually use aperture priority. However, for wildlife and sports photographers, where there is a lot of action and fast movement, this setting is often used, as you can set your shutter speed to a specific value and let the aperture and ISO vary relative to the overall lighting conditions in your scene. In scenes with water, especially breaking waves, I usually photograph in full manual because as the waves break, the scene will get brighter. If I was shooting in aperture priority, the camera would compensate for the increased brightness with a faster shutter speed, resulting in shorter streaks from the waves than I intended. So let's dig into some concrete nature photography examples where I'm going to use different kinds of shutter speeds, and let's start out with the interval 5 to 30 seconds. The most obvious place where you need longer shutter speeds of 5 to 30 seconds are during night, where the lack of light forces you to increase the shutter speed to compensate for that lack of light. You can obviously compensate for that with an open aperture, like a good open prime, and increased ISO, and you will have to optimally combine the settings relative to what you're photographing to get the best possible results. In the case of photographing the Milky Way, you can start with the 500 rule, and for northern lights, I find that the faster the lights move, the faster shutter speed I also want. To get a proper exposure during night for the foreground, I usually make a longer exposure for the foreground and combine the clean foreground photo with the sky photo in Photoshop. For sea, lakes and ocean photography, if you are aiming for that ethereal look with a completely smooth water surface, it is also the longer shutter speeds you want to use. Everything from 10 seconds and up to 2 and 4 minutes will give you this look. The longer the shutter speed, the more smoothed out the water will become. Do note that the effect will be limited beyond 2 minutes. You may also need to use something like a 10-stop filter to achieve those shutter speeds. I do like the ethereal effect in many of my photos, but in some examples there is no doubt I prefer the faster shutter speed over the long exposure. Likewise, if you wish to smooth out the clouds, you will also need the longer shutter speeds, obviously dependent on how fast they move. So how much? And if you actually want to blur the photos is of course down to personal taste, and there is no right or wrong. Intention is what matters. Back in the days, I also used 30 seconds or longer shutter speeds to smooth out waterfalls. They do look very ethereal, and it's an effect I was very fascinated by as a new landscape photographer. However, over the years I found my taste to change, where the bigger the waterfall I photograph, the faster the shutter speed I want. I cover much more about how to photograph waterfalls in my 6 hours and 19 videos course, Mastering Waterfall Photography. There's a link to that down in the description of the video. But let's continue with the semi-long shutter speeds of 1/10 to about 2 seconds. When I want to create action in my seascapes, yet don't want the scene to be super chaotic, I use those shutter speeds. With breaking waves, waves crashing against cliffs, waves crashing against a beach, water running off cliffs or back into the ocean from a beach, you can get some really cool photos where you show the motion of the water, yet because of the semi-long shutter speeds, you still keep some texture in the water. It's kind of a controlled action. A famous location for these streaks is the ice beach in Iceland. I absolutely love photographing here, and hours pass by so fast. It does require a bit of technique to get motion blur and not shake your camera, but when you capture those streaks in combination with the ice, it just looks fabulous. You can play both with the water coming in and water going out. It's the same effect with streams and rivers, where you keep the motion of the water by smoothing out bubbles and foam on the water, yet not so much that you lose the texture. Occasionally, I also find that these long or semi-long exposures work for waterfalls, but it is more the exception than the rule. Smaller or complex waterfalls that run along some cliffs are usually where I want to use the slower shutter speeds. So let's move into the faster shutter speeds, where it's all about avoiding motion blur and get tack sharp photos. Around seascapes, it can make a lot of sense freezing the moment when the waves crash against cliffs. As mentioned, depending on your focal length and distance to the wave, you may need a really fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second or even faster. It also means you will need to both open the aperture and up the ISO to getting the desired brightness. That was the case in this example, where we were photographing on one of the beaches in Iceland. It was both cloudy and around sunset, but I just really wanted to capture the texture and power of those dramatic waves. And as mentioned, with larger waterfalls, I found that I generally prefer fast shutter speeds. In this example, the photo would not be half as dramatic if it wasn't for the small human in front of the waterfall and the fast shutter speed that really freezes the moment and captures all those frightening details in the waterfall. At other times, I simply just want the waterfall to look more realistic. You will capture all the streaks of the falling water with a fast shutter speed, and you keep this sense of scale, and if the spray is being pushed around by the wind, you actually risk losing the sense of power if your shutter speed is too low. I do have one exception in this photo from Skogafoss, but I guess it's the exception that confirms the rule. Here I wanted to capture how the spray was being pushed around by the wind, and I found that a semi-long exposure worked well. In most circumstances, I really want to freeze the moment of bigger waterfalls. In this example, I photographed with a drone and was forced to use a fast shutter speed to avoid the motion blur of the drone. But I find that just like in the previous photo, freezing the water creates much more drama. Here are 3 different shutter speeds from the same waterfall, and you can see how the different shutter speeds create very different perceptions of the same scene. Before we finish off, I just want to let you know that my Black Friday sale is now running. And in this period, you can get entire $100 off my big editing course. Here I cover all my techniques for editing landscape photos. I cover everything from introducing you to the programs. I personally use Camera Raw, which is Photoshop's RAW converter. But if you use Lightroom, the editing algorithm is exactly the same because Lightroom is built on Camera Raw. I cover many different editing techniques, such as basic masking, how to clean your photos properly, dodging and burning, blending and editing with luminosity masks, focus stacking, focal length blending, adding glow and working with atmosphere, and I have added update videos over the years where I cover new features such as masking in Camera Raw or Lightroom. Finally, I have 11 start to finish tutorials where I cover a whole range of different kinds of landscape photos, along with other videos on what mistakes to avoid and how to respect the light. The coupon code to get the $100 off is down in the description of the video along with the link. For photographing or including animals, especially fast-moving birds in your scenes, you also want to keep a fast shutter speed so as to freeze the movement of the animals. Puffins, or generally birds in flight, are great examples of this as they move very fast. Here I photographed these incredible sea cliffs and had some seagulls flying around in the scene. The fast shutter speed was necessary to freeze them in the flight. Here I was photographing this boat on a very still morning, and suddenly I hear this line of geese coming flying into the scene, and I immediately had to up my ISO so that I could also up the shutter speed and capture and freeze the moment when the geese flew over the boat. On recent trips to both Antarctica or Svalbard, I've been photographing from zodiacs moving around in the water. sometimes in quite heavy waves, and here it is completely essential to use a faster shutter speed to avoid the motion blur. And in this photo I captured out the front window of a bus, a fast shutter speed was also necessary to freeze the moment. Over the past couple of years I've also been fortunate enough to photograph a couple of erupting volcanoes in Iceland. As lava is liquid, the shutter speed also highly influences the perception of the photo. In most circumstances I also prefer the faster shutter speeds as they complement and show the drama of an erupting volcano more than the slower shutter speeds do. If you are into editing, you can also combine different exposures. One way is to combine a faster shutter speed photo of a big waterfall in the background with a semi-slow shutter speed of the foreground stream. Alternatively, you can mix both a long exposure and a fast shutter speed photo and reduce the opacity of the foreground layer or mask in specific parts. This technique combines the smoothness of the long exposure with some strong texture from the fast shutter speed exposure. But shutter speed is only one aspect of photography. Aperture and ISO are also essential to be able to take good photos, and you can learn much more about those in these videos. If you want to learn more about editing your photos, be sure to benefit from the Black Friday sale where you can get entire $100 off my post-processing course. If you want to learn more about composition and light, be sure to get my eBOOKs. There are links to everything and my print shop down in the description of the video.